I had seen situations like this before, where the smallest decisions quietly shift the balance of control. The mistake that sealed the outcome wasn't sudden, it was a series of choices made with careful precision. The family services officer reviewing the case noticed the subtle patterns immediately. Responsibilities assumed without discussion, schedules rearranged as if consent were automatic. On the surface, everything appeared ordinary, generous even. Yet beneath that calm, a hidden intent was quietly asserting itself, shaping expectations and limiting freedom. The people involved believed they were acting reasonably, but each step was part of a structure designed to consolidate control. By the time anyone recognized what had happened, the framework was already in place. The question now is, how does a holiday visit turn into a situation where one person feels trapped in plain sight? The first note in the file was written in a careful, even hand. It belonged to a family services mediator named Helen Morrows, a woman who had spent 32 years resolving domestic disputes that never made headlines. She had learned over time that the most consequential cases rarely began with raised voices or dramatic claims. They began with courtesy, with travel arrangements, with holiday plans that appeared generous on the surface. Helen's summary did not assign blame, it did not speculate, it laid out facts in sequence as she had been trained to do. On December 12th, a woman named Ruth Calder, age 68, accepted an airline ticket purchased by her daughter, Elaine Porter. The ticket was round-trip, first leg scheduled for December 18th, return listed as open. The stated purpose was a family Christmas. Ruth had been living alone in Arizona for 6 years. She had no dependents, no criminal history, no history of family conflict on record. Helen noted that the invitation itself was not unusual. Adult children often flew parents home for holidays. The cost was not excessive, the timing was appropriate. The tone of the messages between mother and daughter, reviewed later with consent, was affectionate and polite. Elaine expressed that she missed her mother. Ruth replied that she was looking forward to seeing her grandchildren. The mediator's notes remained neutral. Elaine insisted on booking the ticket herself. At the time, Helen wrote, this detail seemed insignificant. Many people preferred to manage logistics for older relatives. Still, she marked it. She had learned to mark small things. Ruth arrived at her daughter's home in suburban Maryland on a cold afternoon, greeted by Elaine, her husband Mark, and 2 children ages 6 and 8. The house was well kept, recently renovated. There were no signs of stress or disorder. Ruth was given a guest room with fresh linens. Elaine cooked dinner the first night. The children were excited. The visit, by all appearances, began as intended. According to Helen's later interviews, the shift did not occur suddenly. There was no confrontation, no announcement. On the second morning, Elaine mentioned that she and Mark had been feeling exhausted. On the third, she noted that childcare during the school break was expensive. On the fourth, she said something more specific. She and Mark had already booked a short holiday trip for themselves, leaving the day after Christmas. Helen paused when she reached this portion of the record. She reread the transcript. Elaine had not asked Ruth whether she would mind watching the children. She had spoken as though the arrangement were already settled. Flights booked, hotel reserved, non-refundable. Ruth, by her own account, did not respond immediately. She had assumed she would be included in whatever plans her daughter had made. When Elaine clarified that the trip was for just the 2 of them, Ruth laughed. She thought it was a joke. Mark did not laugh. The mediator's notes remained neutral. At this point, expectations diverged, Helen wrote. One party believed the visit was familial, the other believed it was functional. There were no raised voices that day. Ruth helped with dinner. She read to the children. She went to bed early, but she did not sleep. She lay awake replaying the conversation, trying to determine where she had misunderstood. She had not been asked to babysit, she had been told. That distinction mattered to her. Helen underlined another line. Return ticket unspecified. In the days that followed, Elaine spoke more openly about the plan. She left a list on the kitchen counter with school schedules, dietary preferences, emergency contacts. She labeled drawers. She mentioned the neighbors who might help if anything came up. Ruth listened. She did not interrupt. She had raised a daughter. She understood stress. She told herself this was temporary. On December 23rd, Ruth called the airline. She asked about changing her return flight. The representative told her there was no return flight scheduled. The ticket was one way. This was the first moment, Helen later concluded, when the situation crossed from misunderstanding to something else. Not malice necessarily, but presumption. Ruth did not confront her daughter that day. She waited until Christmas Eve when the house was quiet. She asked Elaine calmly when she was expected to return home. Elaine hesitated before answering. She said they would figure it out later. She said it made sense for Ruth to stay a bit longer, help them reset after the holidays. Helen circled the word later. There was no threat, no coercion, just a gradual narrowing of options. Ruth had not driven to Maryland. She had no car there. Her medications were at the house. Her name was not on the utility bills. She was, by circumstance rather than force, dependent. On December 26th, Elaine and Mark left for the airport. The children hugged them goodbye. Ruth stood in the doorway and waved. The house fell quiet. There was no written agreement, no timeline, just an assumption that had solidified without consent. Helen ended part 1 of her report with a single sentence, written carefully. The conflict did not arise from neglect or cruelty, but from an unchallenged belief that availability implied obligation. She left the final line unpunctuated, as if waiting for the next entry to decide what it would become. Ruth Calder's daily life before the trip was simple and largely self-directed. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment outside Tucson, close to a grocery store that she walked most mornings. Her days followed a steady rhythm: coffee at 7, a crossword at the kitchen table, a call to her sister on Wednesdays, a volunteer shift at the library twice a week where she reshelved books and helped children find titles for school reports. She had not expected her retirement years to be busy, but she valued predictability. It gave her a sense of control she had not always had when Elaine was younger, when single motherhood meant juggling schedules and money and worry. Those years had passed. She believed she had earned the quiet. Her relationship with Elaine had improved with distance. Phone calls were pleasant, visits were brief and cordial. She did not interfere in Elaine's parenting. Elaine did not criticize her mother's choices. They spoke about weather, work, the children's grades. It was not intimate, but it was stable. The holiday invitation had felt like a gesture of closeness. Elaine had said she wanted the children to have more time with their grandmother. Ruth had agreed without hesitation. She packed carefully, leaving behind anything she didn't think she would need for 2 weeks. Once Elaine and Mark departed, Ruth settled into a routine that felt familiar in shape, but foreign in weight. She woke early to prepare breakfast. She walked the children to the bus stop. She packed lunches according to the list on the counter. She cleaned the kitchen after dinner. She read bedtime stories and waited until the house was quiet before sitting down herself. There was nothing inherently wrong with the tasks. Ruth had done them before. What unsettled her was the absence of choice. The children's schedules determined her day. She could not leave the house for long. She did not know the area well. Her phone buzzed frequently with messages from Elaine checking in, not to ask how she was managing, but to remind her of details: dentist appointments, homework folders, screen time limits. Ruth responded politely. She did not complain. She told herself this was what family did. Still, she noticed things that did not align with what she had been told. Elaine's messages often referred to an extended stay. "When you're still there next month," one read. She reread it several times. She replied with a neutral acknowledgement and then sat quietly trying to understand how her visit had acquired a timeline without her input. The neighbors introduced themselves as expected. They asked how long Ruth would be on duty. The phrase caught her attention. She smiled and did not correct them. She did not want to seem ungrateful. On January 3rd, the airline called. One of the children had a fever. Ruth handled it competently. She followed the instructions. She sat by the bed with a cool cloth. She felt the familiar tug of responsibility, but she also felt a growing awareness that no one had asked whether she was willing to assume that weight. Elaine and Mark returned from their trip, relaxed. They thanked Ruth. They brought souvenirs. They resumed their routines without discussing next steps. The open return ticket remained unaddressed. When Ruth raised the topic,
Elaine responded with surprise. She said she thought Ruth was enjoying being useful. She said the children were attached to her. She said it would be disruptive to change things now. Helen noted in her interview that this was not said unkindly. That, in many ways, made it difficult to challenge.
Helen Morrows did not look for dramatic proof. She looked for patterns that could be verified. Her role was not to accuse, but to clarify. When Ruth contacted the Family Services Office in late January, she did not describe abuse, she described confusion. That alone was enough for Helen to begin assembling a record. The first materials were mundane: calendars, text messages, travel confirmations. Helen asked Ruth to forward anything related to the original invitation and subsequent plans. Ruth hesitated at first. She worried that collecting evidence implied wrongdoing. Helen explained that documentation did not imply guilt, it created clarity. The flight receipt confirmed what Ruth had already been told by the airline: one-way ticket, purchased by Elaine, no return date. Helen placed it in the file without comment. Next came the messages. Elaine's early texts were affectionate and brief. "We miss you. The kids can't wait." After Ruth arrived, the tone shifted subtly. Messages became instructional. "Don't forget the permission slip. They need to be in bed by 8. I already told the school you'll handle pickup." Helen highlighted the progression, the shift from invitation to assignment. There were no explicit demands. That was notable. In similar cases, Helen often saw clear ultimatums. Here, responsibility was transferred through assumption. Ruth was informed of decisions after they had been made. Her role was implied rather than negotiated. Helen asked Ruth about finances. Ruth said she had not been asked to contribute to household expenses, but she had begun buying groceries and supplies out of habit. Elaine had not objected. Mark had thanked her once, casually, as though it were expected. Receipts showed that Ruth's personal expenses had increased since arriving. Transportation costs were minimal because she rarely left the house, but food, household items, and school supplies appeared regularly on her credit card statement. Helen noted that Ruth's fixed retirement income had not changed. Medical records provided another layer. Ruth's prescriptions had been transferred to a local pharmacy at Elaine's suggestion. Elaine had offered to handle the paperwork to make things easier. The records showed no issue, but the transfer reinforced Ruth's physical anchoring to the location. Returning home would now require coordination and delay. Helen requested school correspondence next. Emails from teachers listed Ruth as the primary daytime contact. Elaine and Mark were copied secondarily. This designation had been made without Ruth's explicit consent. When Helen asked how it happened, Ruth said Elaine had told the school Ruth would be helping out for a while. The phrase appeared again: helping out. Vague, non-binding, yet operationally decisive. Then Helen spoke with Elaine, framing the conversation as routine. She did not accuse, she asked Elaine to describe the arrangement in her own words. Elaine sounded surprised that there was a record at all. She described her mother as eager, involved, happy to be useful. She said Ruth had never objected. Helen asked whether there had been a discussion about duration. Elaine paused. She said not exactly. She said things had evolved naturally. Helen documented the pause. Witness accounts were limited but informative. A neighbor described Ruth as the one holding everything together. A teacher mentioned that Ruth seemed tired but capable. No one described conflict. That absence mattered. Exploitation rarely announced itself. Helen assembled the materials chronologically. Each item alone was unremarkable. Together, they outlined a shift in control. Travel managed by Elaine, communication framed as instruction, responsibilities assigned without consent, dependencies increased gradually. The most revealing document arrived unexpectedly. Ruth had kept the original email Elaine sent when inviting her for the holidays. Helen compared it to later messages. The invitation spoke of family time, of rest, of catching up. There was no mention of childcare, extended stays, or open-ended plans. Helen placed the two sets of messages side by side. The contrast was clear. The original purpose and the current reality no longer aligned. Ruth watched silently as Helen explained the pattern.
She felt a mix of relief and discomfort. Relief that someone else could see what she had struggled to articulate. Discomfort at realizing how thoroughly her role had changed without her noticing the moment it happened. Helen did not label Elaine's behavior as intentional harm. She used a different term, role drift. It occurred when boundaries were not stated and assumptions filled the gap. It was common in families. It became problematic when one person bore the cost. Helen also identified a risk. If Ruth became ill or unable to perform the tasks expected of her, the arrangement could fracture quickly. Without clear agreements, support might vanish as easily as it had appeared. That risk gave Ruth pause. She had assumed that being helpful secured her place. Helen suggested the opposite might be true. When value was tied solely to function, security was fragile. Toward the end of the session, Helen summarized what the evidence established and what it did not. It did not prove malice. It did not prove intent to trap. It did show a consistent pattern of decisions made without Ruth's informed consent, resulting in increased dependence and reduced autonomy. Helen closed the file gently. She told Ruth that the next step depended on what Ruth wanted: clarification, mediation, or simply understanding. Ruth left the office with copies of the documents in her bag. They felt heavier than paper. For the first time since arriving in Maryland, she understood that what she was experiencing had a structure. It was not just discomfort, it was an imbalance that had formed quietly and efficiently. That night, she looked again at the open return ticket confirmation. She noticed something she had missed before. A note at the bottom stated that changes required the purchaser's authorization. She closed her laptop slowly. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was operational, and it was still unfolding. Elaine did not change her behavior immediately. That, Helen later noted, was often the most telling sign. When people believed themselves to be acting reasonably, they saw no reason to adjust. Cooperation, when it appeared, was smooth and rehearsed. The first conversation after Ruth's meeting with Helen took place over dinner. Elaine cooked. She served generous portions. She asked Ruth about her day with a tone that suggested normalcy had never been interrupted. Mark nodded along, distracted by his phone. The children argued about homework. The house sounded the way it always had. When Ruth mentioned that she had spoken to a family services mediator, Elaine paused only briefly. Her fork hovered, then settled back onto the plate. She smiled, softly, as if humoring a misunderstanding. "That seems a bit extreme. I wish you'd talk to me first." There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, just disappointment, carefully measured. Ruth recognized it immediately. She had heard it before, years earlier, when Elaine was a teenager and felt misunderstood. It was a tone designed to re-establish hierarchy without confrontation. Ruth explained slowly that she needed clarity, that she wanted to know how long she was expected to stay, that she wanted to return home. Elaine listened, nodding, her expression sympathetic. When Ruth finished, she reached across the table and touched her hand. "I thought you were happy here. You never said otherwise." The statement was factual on its surface. Ruth had not objected, but Helen's words echoed in her mind. Silence interpreted as consent. Mark cleared his throat. He said he understood Ruth's feelings, but that the timing was difficult. School schedules, work commitments. He spoke in practical terms, as though the question were logistical rather than personal. Elaine added that the children were thriving, that routines mattered, that sudden changes could be disruptive. She did not say that Ruth owed her time. She did not need to. The implication rested between them, unspoken but heavy. Ruth noticed something else. Elaine never asked what Ruth needed, only whether Ruth understood the impact of leaving. Over the next few days, Elaine made visible efforts to appear accommodating. She suggested that Ruth take an afternoon off. She ordered takeout instead of asking Ruth to cook. She spoke warmly in front of the children about how much she appreciated their grandmother. To an outsider, the household looked harmonious. That was the point. But Ruth began to notice small, revealing details. When Ruth declined to handle an errand, Elaine handled it herself, but later remarked on how busy she had been. When Ruth mentioned checking flights, Elaine reminded her that changing plans was expensive. When Ruth suggested setting a firm departure date, Elaine said they could talk about it after an upcoming work deadline. Always later. The mask, as Helen would later describe it, did not slip through cruelty, it slipped through control. One afternoon, Ruth returned from a short walk to find that Elaine had rearranged the guest room. Ruth's suitcase had been placed in the closet, drawers were filled with folded clothes, a small desk had been cleared and stocked with school supplies. "It made sense to organize," Elaine said lightly, "since you're here." The phrase landed with more weight than intended. Ruth stood in the doorway, looking at the room that now looked less like a temporary space and more like an assigned post. That evening, Ruth called Helen. She described the changes. Helen asked careful questions. Had Elaine prevented her from leaving the house? No. Had Elaine refused to book a return flight? Not explicitly. Had there been threats? No. Helen listened, then said something Ruth did not expect. "Control often looks like care," she said, "until you try to step outside it." The next incident was subtler. Ruth had planned to visit a nearby senior center she had found online. She mentioned it casually at breakfast. Elaine frowned just slightly. She said she needed Ruth home that afternoon because the children had early dismissal.
The tension in the house escalated subtly at first, as if each day added an invisible weight to the atmosphere. Ruth noticed it in small gestures. Elaine began checking in multiple times a day, not to ask how she was managing, but to remind her of tasks, homework deadlines, grocery lists, screen time limits. Mark, who had remained mostly passive, began leaving notes for Ruth in the kitchen, casual reminders phrased as suggestions, each one assuming she would comply. The effect was cumulative. It was not overt hostility, but a relentless pressure that made Ruth feel watched without ever being confronted directly. Helen later described this stage as coercion by normalization. The antagonists, consciously or not, reinforced dependency by creating a system in which Ruth's options were constantly constrained. Leaving would no longer be a simple matter of buying a flight and driving home. It would disrupt schedules, require coordination, and most importantly, challenge the illusion of harmony they had maintained. Ruth's days grew longer. Tasks that were simple at first, preparing meals, coordinating school pickups, managing bedtime, expanded into responsibilities she had not anticipated. Holidays became a revolving series of errands: school parties, extracurricular events, grocery shortages, and the quiet, constant maintenance of a household that was not hers. She found herself running from task to task, rarely sitting for more than a few minutes. At the same time, she began to notice a shift in the children's behavior. They had grown accustomed to her presence as the constant, reliable caregiver. When she attempted to step back briefly, they complained, pouted, or asked repeatedly when she would be home again. Ruth felt the pull of responsibility and the sting of guilt, compounded by Elaine's subtle framing, "The kids really need you." It was said as a matter of fact, leaving no space for debate. Ruth tried to push back gently at first. She suggested a morning off, hoping to reclaim small pieces of autonomy. Elaine hesitated, then argued practicalities: appointments, errands, continuity for the children. Mark added his voice quietly: "We can manage, but it's smoother if you handle it." The words were soft, reasonable, but the message was clear. Ruth's attempt at independence had been noticed, evaluated, and subtly undermined. As the days went on, the pressure increased. Helen described it as the transition from passive assumption to active enforcement. It was not delivered through threats or raised voices. It was delivered through the expectation that Ruth would always prioritize the family's convenience over her own. Every refusal was met with an almost imperceptible sigh, a tight smile, or a slight distancing in conversation. Over time, these small signals carried more weight than a single confrontation could have. Ruth's internal reasoning began to shift. She questioned herself constantly. Was she overreacting? Was she ungrateful? Was this just the natural ebb and flow of family life? The tension was deliberate, though invisible, strategically subtle, Helen would later note, to make the target doubt her own perceptions. Elaine's subtle pressure soon extended into monitoring. She began asking Ruth to check in more often during errands. She requested updates about meals, schedules, and even minor household matters. Mark followed suit with casual comments in the hallway or at breakfast. "Did you handle this yet?"
Remember to... It was relentless, though calm. Ruth began to feel trapped not by force but by obligation. She could not simply leave. Her duties had been framed as indispensable. Attempts to assert independence met resistance thinly veiled as care. It was no longer a question of whether she wanted to stay or leave. It was a question of whether she could find a way to make a choice without disrupting the household, disappointing the children, or violating her own sense of responsibility. Helen reviewed these developments carefully. She noted the hallmarks of psychological pressure that often preceded overt conflict: creeping dependence, normalized expectation, and quiet moral framing. Ruth was being nudged into compliance at every opportunity, her autonomy shrinking day by day. The antagonists were not cruel, yet they had created a system that made resistance increasingly costly, socially and emotionally. The first clear sign that the situation had become critical came on a Friday evening. Ruth mentioned she wanted to leave early the following week to attend a medical appointment in Arizona. Elaine paused at the mention, then responded in carefully neutral tones. "We'll see how that works. The kids' schedules are complicated. Maybe we can plan around it." Mark added quietly, "It might be easier if you stayed another week. The kids like having you around." On the surface, they sounded accommodating, but Ruth knew better. The subtext was unmistakable. Her plans were negotiable only if they aligned with the family's convenience. Her own needs were secondary. The culmination of these subtle pressures began to take a personal toll. Ruth noticed fatigue creeping in, headaches from the constant scheduling, and anxiety when she even considered asserting herself. She felt emotionally exhausted, not from a single confrontation, but from the unending quiet expectation that she be available and compliant. Helen, reflecting on similar cases, explained that this stage was critical. The antagonist's behavior was no longer passive. The danger shifted from simple inconvenience to a situation that could have irreversible consequences for Ruth's independence. Continued compliance risked eroding her confidence, making her increasingly reliant on routines set by Elaine and Mark, and further normalizing their assumption of control. By mid-February, Ruth recognized that the household was no longer her temporary stay. It had become a structured environment in which her time, energy, and autonomy were systematically absorbed. The subtle psychological pressure, polite reminders, framing of her role, and conditional praise had grown into an inescapable gravity. Each day reinforced that leaving would require negotiation, confrontation, and moral justification. That night, as she sat quietly in the living room after tucking the children to bed, Ruth realized the true nature of the challenge. She was not dealing with overt hostility or cruelty. She was dealing with a system meticulously designed to maintain control while appearing benign, cooperative, and even loving. Helen's voice echoed in her mind. Control often hides behind care. Recognition is the first step to reclaiming choice. Ruth understood now that clarity and action would be required, but she also understood that the next steps would be delicate. Any misstep could escalate the pressure into outright conflict. The escalation had shifted from subtle expectation to calculated reinforcement. Ruth's options had narrowed, her responsibilities had multiplied, and her autonomy had quietly eroded. She was in the eye of a carefully maintained storm, and the next move, whether by her or by Elaine and Mark, would determine the outcome. The next day, Ruth began to plan. Not impulsively, but strategically. She made mental notes, quietly reviewing routines, looking for windows of opportunity, and considering what measures could be taken if the pressure continued to mount. It was the first time in weeks that she felt a faint sense of agency return. She had recognized the trap forming around her, and she intended to confront it on her terms. The trap, as Helen would later write, was no longer abstract. It had become operational. The stage was set, the pressure applied, and the pieces were aligned. Now, Ruth needed a strategy, controlled, deliberate, and inevitable, to regain her life. Ruth approached the following days with careful observation. She no longer responded immediately to every request. She noted schedules, routines, and behaviors, marking each pattern in a small notebook she kept tucked in her handbag. Each detail mattered. the children's school drop-off times, Elaine's work calls, Mark's weekly meeting schedule, and even small habits, like the way Elaine left the kitchen light on in the evening, formed a map of the household dynamics. Ruth knew she could not act impulsively. The trap was sophisticated, built on the assumption of her compliance, and any misstep could trigger confrontation or escalate pressure further. Helen advised her to think like an investigator. Ruth needed to understand exactly when she had freedom of movement, what the stakes were for each action, and how the family might respond to resistance. It was not a matter of anger or rebellion. It was a matter of strategy, of reclaiming control in a house where autonomy had been quietly eroded. The first step was documentation. Ruth began keeping a detailed log of interactions, carefully noting every time Elaine or Mark made decisions for her or framed expectations as obligations. Notes were precise: time, date, content of the conversation, and her own responses. Helen emphasized that accurate records created clarity and reduced ambiguity, proof not of malice but of pattern. Next came preparation. Ruth researched return flights, backup care for the children if necessary, and local contacts she could call in case Elaine or Mark attempted to block her plans. She quietly coordinated with the school to ensure they had her official contact information, separate from Elaine. She arranged for transportation to the airport without announcing it to the household. Each step was small and calculated, minimizing confrontation while maximizing leverage. The controlled confrontation was planned like a professional operation. Ruth waited for a window when both Elaine and Mark were out of the house simultaneously, but the children were at school. The timing ensured that she could act without immediate interference, while having witnesses, teachers, neighbors, or staff available if complications arose. She rehearsed what she would say, focusing on calm, measured language. No accusations, just statements of fact and clear boundaries. On the day, the air felt charged. Ruth followed her plan meticulously.
The following morning, Ruth awoke earlier than usual, her mind quiet but alert. Everything had been arranged the night before. The children's lunches packed, backpacks ready, notes left for the teachers, and the transportation to the airport confirmed. The clarity of her plan lent a sense of calm she had not felt in weeks. What remained was the final confrontation. Not explosive, not dramatic, but precise, inevitable, and factual. Elaine appeared in the kitchen first, carrying her coffee. She greeted Ruth with a measured smile, the kind that suggested politeness but held a subtle question. Had she fully considered her decision? Ruth responded evenly, returning the smile with a nod. No emotion, no argument, just the facts and arrangements she had prepared. Mark arrived shortly afterward. He glanced at the packed suitcase near the front door, the clear indicator that Ruth's decision was not tentative. "I see you're serious," he said quietly. His tone betrayed a flicker of surprise, the first real crack in the composure they had maintained for weeks. "Yes," Ruth said simply. "I've planned everything. The children are taken care of, the school has my contact, and my flight leaves at 7:30 a.m. Thursday." Elaine hesitated. Her hand paused mid-sip of coffee. Then, almost involuntarily, she said, "But you've been here so long. We've counted on you. I thought we were fine." Her voice wavered slightly. For the first time, the veneer of calm was thin, the mask was faltering. Ruth kept her tone steady. "I understand, Elaine. I know my presence has helped, but it is no longer temporary. I need to return home. I've ensured the transition will be smooth for everyone, especially the children." The hesitation that followed was brief but telling. Mark's jaw tightened. He leaned against the counter, silent. Elaine's eyes darted toward him as though seeking a silent signal. For weeks, they had coordinated silently to maintain control, to subtly shape Ruth's choices. Now, their synchronized defense wavered. Then came the statement that would mark the collapse of their quiet authority. Elaine, almost whispering, said, I thought you liked being here. I thought this was what you wanted." The words, intended to guilt or confuse, did the opposite.
Ruth's preparation had anticipated them. She did not waver. "I do enjoy spending time with the children," she said calmly, "but enjoyment does not equate to obligation. This visit was planned as temporary. It has extended without my consent, and now I am setting a boundary." Mark opened his mouth as if to protest, but Elaine cut in with a sharp inhale, realizing too late that she had already spoken too much. The hesitation, the faltering voice, the unscripted admission that Ruth's presence had been assumed rather than requested were the cracks Helen had warned about. The room's tension shifted subtly. Elaine's composure had crumbled under the weight of Ruth's preparation and insistence. She made a critical error. She tried to appeal to morality rather than reason. We just thought," she began, trailing off. Ruth did not need her to finish. The pattern was evident. Decisions had been made on assumption, convenience had been framed as familial necessity, and autonomy had been quietly eroded. Elaine's incomplete justification, paired with Mark's silent acquiescence, was the admission that the household had operated under a structure that treated Ruth's compliance as a given rather than a choice. The final confirmation came when Elaine, in a moment of frustration, added, "I just didn't think you'd actually follow through." That was the fatal mistake. In attempting to assert moral high ground, she revealed the manipulative framework that had underpinned the last 8 weeks. Ruth remained calm, firm, and factual. No yelling, no accusations, just clarity. She was leaving, her arrangements were in place, and no further justification was required. The children arrived shortly after. Ruth greeted them warmly, maintaining routines, masking the tension in the adults' interaction. To them, the day was normal. To Elaine and Mark, it was a demonstration of the inevitability that Ruth had meticulously orchestrated. Their authority had no bearing over what had been prepared, documented, and communicated. By the time the family settled into a quiet mid-morning, Elaine and Mark had shifted into a resigned silence. Their previous strategies of passive pressure and moral framing were ineffective against the precision of Ruth's planning. She had anticipated their arguments, prepared countermeasures, and reinforced her boundaries with clear, factual actions. Helen later described this stage as the collapse and confession moment. No explosive confrontation, no dramatic shouting. The collapse happened quietly, inevitably, through the juxtaposition of preparation against expectation. Elaine and Mark, despite their intentions to maintain control, had failed to recognize the independent agency Ruth now reclaimed. Ruth felt a sense of clarity she had not experienced since arriving in Maryland. The collapse was not personal triumph or vindication, it was the restoration of balance. The unacknowledged system of dependency had been exposed, acknowledged indirectly by the family through their hesitation, incomplete statements, and faltering composure. By late morning, Ruth packed the final items, double-checked all arrangements, and quietly left the house. There was no confrontation at the door, no last-minute attempts to alter her plans. The collapse had done its work internally in the minds of Elaine and Mark, who had realized, perhaps for the first time, that assumption could not replace consent. The departure itself was calm, orderly, and respectful. Ruth's car loaded, she turned back briefly, meeting Elaine's eyes. No words were exchanged. The acknowledgement was silent, yet unmistakable. The balance had shifted, and her autonomy had been reclaimed. Helen would later note in her report that this stage, where the antagonists unintentionally confirmed the dependency they had assumed, was the pivotal moment. Compliance was no longer optional. Ruth's preparation, timing, and measured presentation forced recognition, exposed the structural imbalance, and achieved a confession without confrontation. The collapse was quiet, but its consequences were lasting. Ruth had regained control of her choices, and the household could no longer operate under the assumption that her presence was automatic. Boundaries had been restored, autonomy re-established, and the system that had eroded her freedom dismantled methodically. Ruth drove away that morning feeling the weight of weeks lift from her shoulders. She had anticipated, prepared, and acted deliberately. The trap had been identified, engaged, and neutralized. Control had been reclaimed, not through conflict or anger, but through clarity, strategy, and calm determination. The aftermath of Ruth's departure was calm, measured, and deliberate. There were no dramatic scenes, no shouting, no physical confrontations. What followed was a methodical restoration of clarity, responsibility, and accountability within the household. Ruth's absence immediately highlighted what had been assumed, tolerated, and relied upon in her extended stay. Elaine and Mark found themselves facing the practical consequences of the decisions they had made without the buffer of Ruth's quiet compliance. The first week after Ruth left, Elaine and Mark encountered a series of minor logistical challenges they long delegated. School pickups needed adjustment, after-school activities required coordination, meals had to be planned and executed without Ruth's familiar structure. Each inconvenience was a factual reminder of the reliance they had cultivated and the assumption of her presence. There was no anger, only realization, the kind that comes quietly and weighs heavily over time. For Ruth, the experience was different. She returned to her own home with a sense of regained autonomy. Her schedule was hers to manage. The small daily decisions that had been dictated, subtly or overtly, by the household in Maryland were now hers alone. Helen noted that one of the most profound effects of this stage was the psychological. Ruth experienced restored confidence, a reduction in fatigue and anxiety, and the re-establishment of her personal agency. There was also an opportunity for measured accountability. Ruth contacted Elaine and Mark by phone once she had settled at home. Her tone remained calm, factual, and non-confrontational. She explained that she had returned safely, and the arrangements she had put in place before leaving had ensured the children's schedules remained uninterrupted. She emphasized the importance of mutual understanding and respect for boundaries in the future. Elaine hesitated on the line, then spoke with surprising clarity. I realize now that we assumed too much. We didn't consider your perspective or the impact of how long you were staying. I see that now." Her words lacked defensiveness, replaced by the sober acknowledgement of error. Mark added quietly, "We didn't mean to take advantage. We relied on you too much without realizing it." Ruth listened, accepting the
Ruth returned to her own home with a sense of quiet relief that was deeper than she had anticipated. The weeks in Maryland had been exhausting, filled with subtle pressures, unspoken expectations, and the constant need to navigate an environment where her autonomy had been quietly eroded. Yet the resolution had not come through conflict or confrontation. It had come through clarity, preparation, and calm persistence. That realization gave her a profound sense of accomplishment and, most importantly, restored confidence in her ability to assert boundaries when necessary. In the weeks following her departure, Ruth took time to reflect. She considered the ways her own habits had allowed the household in Maryland to assume her compliance. She recognized that her long-standing patterns of caretaking, her desire to avoid conflict, and her commitment to family harmony had all contributed to the subtle erosion of her independence. This acknowledgement was not guilt, it was insight. Understanding her own tendencies helped her see that boundaries were not a betrayal of kindness, but a necessary framework for healthy relationships. Elaine and Mark eventually reached out in measured, thoughtful ways. Their messages and calls were free of pressure or subtle expectation. They inquired about Ruth's well-being and shared updates about the children, but they framed these communications around respect and transparency. It was evident that the quiet but inevitable collapse during Ruth's departure had led them to reassess their behavior. They understood that convenience could not replace consent, and that family support, while important,
must always be mutual. Ruth's relationship with her grandchildren stabilized into a rhythm that was predictable, nurturing, and balanced. She continued to spend time with them, but on terms that honored her own needs and commitments. Every visit was a choice, not an obligation. This dynamic reinforced for Ruth, and for the children, the principle that care should be shared freely, not extracted through assumption or subtle pressure. Helen's guidance remained a touchstone. Ruth frequently revisited her notes and the lessons she had learned from the structured approach to reclaiming her autonomy. Observing, documenting, planning, and calmly asserting boundaries had been more effective than any confrontational strategy. Ruth realized that intelligence, patience, and preparation were as vital as emotional courage when navigating complex interpersonal dynamics. In reflection, Ruth also recognized the broader lesson. Relationships, even within families, thrive when boundaries are respected and communication is clear. Dependence should never become entrapment, and care should never be weaponized by expectation. She understood now that kindness and generosity could coexist with firmness and self-respect, and that insisting on one's rights, quietly, deliberately, and calmly, was a form of love for oneself as well as for others. The experience also brought Ruth a new sense of peace. She no longer carried the lingering guilt for wanting her life back. She no longer doubted the validity of her needs. She had experienced firsthand how subtle pressures could accumulate, how compliance could be assumed without consent, and how autonomy could be reclaimed methodically. She had turned a situation of quiet exploitation into one of empowerment, and the lessons from those weeks remained with her, guiding her decisions and her relationships. Months later, when Ruth looked back, she saw the arc of those weeks as a testament to resilience and careful reasoning. She understood that the most significant victories are often quiet, unseen, and executed with patience. She had acted decisively when necessary, yet gently when possible. Her calm clarity restored balance without confrontation. Her preparation exposed structural assumptions, and her persistence ensured her autonomy remained intact. The moral of her experience was simple, yet profound. Autonomy is earned and maintained through deliberate action. Boundaries are expressions of respect, and control, when imposed, assumed, or manipulated, must be met with clarity and resolute. Ruth had learned that restoring fairness and balance does not require anger, but it does require awareness, strategy, and unwavering commitment to one's own agency. In the end, life returned to a quiet, reflective normalcy. Ruth spent her days on her terms, connected to family, mindful of responsibilities, yet free to choose when and how she participated. Elaine and Mark adapted as well, learning that respect and collaboration are far more sustainable than expectation and assumption. Ruth's story concluded not with drama or spectacle, but with dignity, equilibrium, and understanding. She had faced an intricate challenge, navigated it with intelligence, and reclaimed her life with both grace and resolve. The experience became a quiet reference point, a reminder that even within the most familiar relationships, autonomy must be asserted, boundaries must be maintained, and clarity of choice is both necessary and achievable. The final reflection settled over Ruth like a gentle, reassuring presence. Freedom, once recognized and acted upon, is not only a right, it is a responsibility to oneself and the cornerstone of every healthy, lasting relationship.